Before I start telling you everything, I need you to promise me something. Stay with me until the very end, because every word you hear is a truth someone tried to bury. If you've ever felt silenced or like the world didn't believe you, hit that like button now, comment I see you below. And make sure you're subscribed, because this story isn't just mine, it's ours. I remember the night they locked me in that room the way people remember car crashes, every second stretched, every breath too loud, every heartbeat trembling inside my ribs, like something trying to escape. It was 2:47 a.m., winter of 2013, the house freezing, because they always turned the heater off at night to save money, even though Dad had spent $10,000 on a new truck the month before. "She's losing it," I heard my aunt whisper as my mother fumbled with the key, the metal shaking in her hand like she was terrified of me. But I wasn't screaming, I wasn't violent, I wasn't doing anything except remembering the attic, the smell of mold and dust and fear. The way his voice used to echo above me like God speaking through rotten wood. And yet somehow, in their story, I was the threat. In their story, I was the broken one. I sat on the floor, knees pulled up to my chest, my palms cold against the tile as the lock clicked. A simple sound, but it hit me harder than any slap ever did. "You need rest," my mother said through the door. "You don't know what's real anymore," but I did. I knew the way the boards creaked on the third step going up to the attic. I knew the scratchy wool blanket that left red marks on my arms. I knew the smell of cheap aftershave and old beer. I knew the silence of a house pretending nothing was happening. The truth didn't fade when I got older, it sharpened, like glass under sunlight. And the worst part wasn't the memories, it was watching their eyes, calm and composed, like I was some fragile creature they had to manage. Like they weren't the reason I learned to hide inside my own head to survive. They always used the same sentences, as if rehearsed. "It's stress, she imagines things, she's always been sensitive." Sensitive, as if sensitivity could invent trauma vivid enough to leave physical nausea years later, as if sensitivity explained waking up at 16 with bruises and no one asking why. I used to try to reason with them, show them dates, moments, details only someone who lived through it could know. But reason means nothing against a family determined to bury something. To them, denial wasn't lying, it was survival. Pretending was easier than facing what they'd allowed. And every time I spoke, I watched their faces shift, not with concern, but calculation, like they were rearranging the narrative to keep themselves clean. Sometimes I wonder when they decided I was the problem. Was it when I first cried too loudly at age 7? When I refused to go upstairs alone at 10? When I trembled every time he entered the house at 12? Or was it when I turned 20 and finally said the words out loud at the dinner table, voice shaking, hands trembling, because silence had been killing me slowly for years? I remember the plate still full, steam rising from the rice and beans, the hum of the refrigerator louder than my heartbeat. I remember my mother's fork freezing halfway to her mouth, my father staring at the wall instead of at me, my cousin dropping her phone. And then, the thing that broke something inside me forever, my uncle laughing softly. A slow, ugly chuckle, like my pain was some private joke only he understood. "You always had such an imagination," he'd said. Just 7 words, but they detonated everything. I felt my body shut down, like someone flipped a switch and drained every ounce of warmth from my bones. I wasn't making a confession, I was performing in a play they had already written, and my role was the unstable one. They didn't panic. They didn't argue. They calmly, collectively rewrote history in front of me, their voices controlled, steady, practiced. My mother finally spoke after what felt like hours, her voice soft like she was consoling a child who believed in monsters. "Sweetheart, nothing like that ever happened, you just need help." And I remember thinking, help. Help from the people who stood silent while I drowned. Help from the same walls that heard everything and pretended to be deaf. That night in the locked room, I pressed my forehead to the cold door, the wood rough against my skin, and whispered to myself, because there was no one else who would listen, if I'm crazy, why does it hurt in places no one can see? Shadows crawled across the floor from the hallway light, stretching like claws. I could hear them talking downstairs, muffled but urgent, like they were planning a story before the world asked questions. I curled my fingers into fists until my nails dug crescents into my palms. Pain was grounding. Pain reminded me I wasn't imagining anything. And as I sat there shivering, heart hammering, I made a silent promise I would remember. I would not let their version become the truth. Memory was all I had, and they feared it more than they feared losing me. The morning after they locked me in that room, I woke to a sharp line of sunlight cutting across the tiles, burning into my closed eyes like the world was trying to remind me time was still moving. Even if I wasn't, my throat was dry, tongue heavy, pulse slow and shaky from hours of holding fear in my chest like breath underwater. I remember counting the cracks in the wall, whispering each number so my voice wouldn't disappear completely, because when people convince you you're broken, silence becomes a cage that fits too well. When they finally opened the door, it wasn't with urgency or guilt. It was calm, deliberate, like they were releasing a dangerous animal. My mother stood there holding a glass of orange juice and 2 pills. "For your nerves," she said, voice gentle enough to sound like love if I didn't already know the shape of her convenience. But I had learned by then that sometimes poison comes in soft hands, and control comes disguised as concern. So I didn't take them. I held the pills in my palms until they warmed, then slipped them into my pocket, the tiny tablets feeling heavier than stones. We sat at the kitchen table in silence, sunlight drifting through lace curtains that made everything look softer than it really was. As if the house wanted to keep its secrets even in the way it filtered light. My father read the newspaper, or pretended to, flipping pages slow, eyes never lifting to meet mine. He used absence like armor if he didn't acknowledge the truth, it couldn't stain him. My aunt busied herself cleaning dishes that were already spotless, scrubbing the same plate over and over like she could erase the memory of last night if she just rubbed hard enough. And I sat there, staring at the steam rising from my coffee, trying to figure out which felt worse, the fact that they thought gaslighting me would work, or the terrifying realization that it almost had. Because when everyone around you calls your truth delusion, your mind becomes a battlefield where doubt and memory tear each other apart. Later that week, they suggested I take a break from school, not because they worried about me, but because control is easier when your world shrinks. It was my 3rd semester of psychology, which was ironic enough to taste bitter. I remember staring at the tuition statement on my desk 18 reels. For 100 paid through late nights working as a cashier, lunch breaks studying in dusty bus terminals, and weekends cleaning apartments bigger than our house ever dreamed of being. I had clawed my way toward a future they never imagined for me, and suddenly they wanted to cut the rope just when I was learning to climb. "You're overwhelmed," my aunt said. "Come home for a while, focus on yourself." But home had never been rest. It had always been a place where truth suffocated and lies breathed freely. Still, I nodded, because fighting felt pointless when every voice around me spoke the same scripted denial, and exhaustion can disguise surrender as peace. At night, I lay in my old bed, the same one where I cried silently as a child, trying not to let the springs squeak, because noise meant attention, and attention meant danger. The wallpaper hadn't changed, tiny blue flowers, peeling near the window, like even the walls were tired of pretending. I stared at the ceiling and replayed everything, rewinding memories like security footage in my mind, the attic door creaking, the hush of voices. Downstairs ignoring every plea, his footsteps always predictable, always heavy, like guilt walking onto legs. And I remembered the day I tried to tell the school counselor at 15, voice trembling so hard the words came out broken, and how, hours later, My mother showed up with that same practice smile and said I was confused, emotional, dramatic. The counselor believed her. Adults always believe the calm liar over the shaking truth. That was the first time they called me unstable. The first time I wondered if maybe I was. But doubt is fragile when faced with memory. And memories don't dissolve just because people beg them to disappear. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, my cousin knocked on my door, eyes soft, voice low. "Maybe it's better to let it go," she whispered, like she was offering wisdom instead of surrender. What's done is done, but it wasn't done. It lived in my bones, in my breathing, in the way my body flinched at footsteps even years later. Healing doesn't grow where truth is buried alive. I asked her one question, quiet but sharp. If it never happened, why are you all so afraid of me talking? Her face froze, fear flickering for just a second before she masked it with practiced pity. "You need help," she murmured. And I realized then they weren't protecting me from madness. They were protecting themselves from memory. That week, they booked me a psychiatrist appointment without asking. I watched my mother fill out the forms in the waiting room, lies flowing from her pen like she'd rehearsed them for years. "Family history of delusion," she wrote. "Trauma imagination tendencies." I almost laughed. I almost screamed. Instead, I sat still, nails digging into my palms again, because in that moment I understood something horrifying. They would rather rewrite my entire existence than face one moment of accountability. And if I didn't learn to hold my truth fiercely, they would steal it and call the theft love. When the doctor finally called my name, my mother squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Just tell him you're stressed, not scared, not hurting, not remembering." Stressed, like anxiety, was the villain, not history. I walked into that office carrying every version of myself they tried to erase: the child who trembled in silence, the teenager who dared to speak, the woman now labeled fragile for refusing to forget. And I made a decision before I even sat down. I would not let them medicate my memory, dilute my voice, turn my survival into a symptom. Because sanity isn't forgetting what happened. Sanity is remembering even when they call you crazy for doing it. I walked out of that psychiatrist's office with the sound of my own heartbeat echoing louder than his questions ever had, each thump a reminder that memory has a pulse. And mine refused to flatline just because a man with framed diplomas decided to call it stress-induced cognitive distortion. I could still feel his gaze on me, clinical and cold. Taking notes like my pain was a case study instead of a history carved into the quiet hours of my childhood. He never once asked what happened, only why I believed it. There's a special kind of wound in realizing people care more about the story being inconvenient than about it being true. Outside, the air felt thick, humid. The kind of heat Sao Paulo gets in late November when even the wind feels exhausted. My mother walked beside me, her purse clutched tight, pretending relief, as if a 30-minute session could erase years of nights I curled into myself, shaking quietly so the walls wouldn't rat me out. "See," she said softly, "you're just overwhelmed." And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because fighting in that moment felt like bleeding in shark-filled water. I kept thinking about that attic, how the dust always floated in slow motion when the door opened, how the light from the single bulb flickered like it was scared too, how my breathing never belonged to me up there. And it hit me, the world calls it trauma when strangers do it, but when it happens inside the same house you grew up in, they call it imagination, phase, confusion. Anything except what it really was: betrayal wrapped in family photos and Sunday lunches. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the floor of my old bedroom, back against the wardrobe, staring at the streetlights leaking through the curtains. Each headlight's flash across the ceiling, a reminder of life moving outside this suffocating bubble. I held those pills in my hand again, tiny and silent, knowing if I swallowed them, my memories would blur, edges softened until even I questioned them. And maybe that's what they wanted more than silence. They wanted me to doubt myself so deeply that the past died without witnesses. But truth doesn't die. It waits. It hides in the ache of old bruises you can't see anymore, in the way your body stiffens at certain footsteps, in the taste of fear that still shows up at the back of your throat when someone uses a gentle voice to say something cruel. Around 3 a.m., thunder rolled across the sky, heavy like the universe clearing its own chest, and I whispered to the dark, "If I forget, then they win." My voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of remembering alone. I thought about the birthdays he attended, the gifts he brought, the way relatives joked he loved me most, and how I used to freeze every time, smiling so hard my jaw ached. Because children learn early that screaming makes you the problem. I thought about my school notebooks, pages smudged with tears I wiped before anyone saw, trying to write like nothing lived in the shadows upstairs. And then I remembered the night everything snapped, the night I was 16 and he leaned in the doorway of my room, breath heavy, voice dripping that same fake sweetness. And I finally said it, no, a single syllable that felt like holding fire. He walked away that night, but his footsteps stayed in my bones for years, echoing louder than his absence. When I told my mother the next morning, she didn't gasp or rage or shake or hold me. She just blinked slow, like I'd inconvenienced the day, then whispered, "Don't start." That was the moment I stopped being a daughter and became a liability. I traced that day in my mind like a scar. February 11, 2011, 10:24 a.m. Sunlight through the kitchen window, dust dancing like confetti for a celebration that never existed. And now, sitting years later in the same house, walls still humming with secrets, I realized something terrifying in its clarity. They didn't call me crazy because they thought I was wrong. They called me crazy because they knew I was right. And truth spoken by the silent one is a fire no family built on denial can survive. So I hid the pills in the back of the closet, behind a showbox filled with childhood drawings of a home I thought was safe, and I whispered to every younger version of myself trapped in this place, "I believe you. I'm not abandoning you." That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel insane. I felt dangerous because remembering is rebellion, and I was just getting started. The morning after I hid the pills, I woke with that strange feeling that happens right before a storm there, heavy, the silence violent, like the world was waiting to see who would break first. My body felt stiff, not from fear this time, but from a new tension I didn't recognize at first. Later, I understood it was resolve, raw and trembling but real. My mother was already in the kitchen, humming like nothing in the universe could ever be wrong, like she hadn't spent years smoothing lies into the wallpaper of this house. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, strong, bitter, always to spoonfuls of sugar in hers, none in mine, because she said sweetness makes you soft. I used to believe her. I used to think strength meant swallowing pain without flinching, folding reality into neat boxes, locking them away so no one saw the mess. But strength isn't silence. Strength is standing in a room where everyone calls you delusional and still saying, "I know what happened." At breakfast, they watched me the way people watch a ticking clock waiting for something explosive. My aunt's voice was too soft when she asked how I slept. My cousin avoided my eyes, stirring her tea so long the spoon clinked like a tiny alarm. And then my mother slid a folded paper across the table as if it was something simple, something practical, not a trap disguised as concern. "A clinic," she said gently. "They specialize in memory disorders." I didn't touch the paper. The word memory cut deeper than any diagnosis ever could, because they weren't afraid of illness, they were afraid of recollection. A clinic would mean silence, medication, supervision, a new lock, just more professional. I met her gaze, steady, and said, "My memory works fine." Her jaw tightened so subtly most people wouldn't notice, but I'd spent a lifetime studying micro-expressions in this house. Silence stretched, elastic and suffocating. Until my father cleared his throat and muttered something about not making things harder than they need to be, harder, as if truth was an obstacle instead of liberation. I spent the afternoon walking the neighborhood, the same cracked sidewalks I used to ride my bike on at age 9, knees scraped, hair messy, believing the world was big and safe and mine to explore. Funny how streets don't change, but you come back different older. Heavier with ghosts no one else sees, because they never stayed to watch you fight them. The bakery on the corner still smelled like fresh pau francas, 75 reals each just like back then, and the owner still wore that faded blue apron dusted with flour. He smiled when he saw me, called me Menina Estudiosa like he always did, asked about college. My stomach twisted because for a moment I felt seen not as a problem, not as a fragile story, but as someone who built something. And I hated how quickly that warmth turned into shame, as if answering "I'm back home for a while" was a confession of failure instead of survival. Trauma has a strange way of making victory look like retreat. When I got home, the house was quiet in that suspicious way, like it was holding its breath. I heard murmurs in the living room, voices low, urgent. I stopped before entering, letting the shadows swallow me as I listened to the people who claimed to love me more than anything. "She's going to ruin everything," my aunt whispered. "We should have handled this earlier." My father said nothing, and silence can be its own weapon. Then my mother, always the orchestrator, always the voice that softened cruelty into logic, answered, "She's just confused. Once she accepts it didn't happen, things will go back to normal." Normal. That word tasted rotten. Normal was denial. Normal was me pretending I didn't shake when footsteps echoed behind me. Normal was burying the child I once was so the adults could sleep at night. I stepped into the room, and every voice died mid-sentence. They stiffened like actors caught out of character. "Talking about me?" I asked. My tone was calm, almost gentle, but I felt power humming in my bones like electricity under skin. They exchanged glances, searching for a script. My mother offered that pity smile, the one she used when she wanted to look like the hero in a tragedy she created. "We're worried about you," she said. I laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just that single breath of disbelief when the world becomes too absurd to process quietly. "You're worried about yourselves," I corrected. "You're worried I won't forget." My father lowered his gaze. My aunt's fingers tightened around her glass. No one denied it. That silence told more truth than any confession. That night, I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled out an old notebook from a box under my bed, the one where teenage me used to scribble fragments, dates, smells, sounds. Pieces of memory like broken glass I collected because one day I knew I'd need proof. Page after page, I traced each entry with my fingertips, whispering them aloud like prayers. June 14, 2009. Attic light flickering. Heavy footsteps. September 2nd, 2010. Wool blanket. Smell of alcohol. Couldn't breathe. February 11th, 2011. Kitchen sunlight. Don't start. These weren't hallucinations. They were timestamps. And the more I read, the more clarity sharpened inside me. People say time heals, but time didn't heal me, truth did. And truth hurts before it frees you. At 2:13 a.m., I looked at my reflection in the dark window, eyes tired, posture tense, but something fierce glowing behind the exhaustion. I whispered to that reflection, to the child I once was, to every memory they tried to drown, "I'm not crazy. I'm remembering." And in that quiet, I felt something shift like the first crack in a wall that's been holding for too long. Because they can call you unstable, dramatic, confused, fragile, but once you reclaim your story, you become unpredictable in the best way. You stop being their version of you, and that makes you dangerous. Not to yourself, never to yourself, but to the illusion they build. Memory isn't punishment. It's proof. And proof terrifies people who built safety on silence. I woke the next day with a decision sitting on my chest, like a weight carved from truth, heavy, solid, undeniable. For years I thought survival meant staying quiet, walking carefully, shrinking myself so I wouldn't disturb the fragile peace of people who didn't deserve peace. But peace built on a child's silence is not peace, it is rot wearing perfume. And I was done smelling like sacrifice. I walked into the kitchen still in yesterday's clothes, hair messy, face bare, and for the first time in months I didn't try to look composed. Composure had been my armor once. But now I understood that sometimes armor numbs more than it protects. My mother glanced up from the stove, spatula in hand, watching me like someone waiting for a fuse to spark. My father sipped coffee, eyes glued to the news, pretending not to see me the way he pretended not to see anything that didn't fit the version of life he built like a house of cards. And I, with a voice steady from a night of remembering and not collapsing, said, "I'm leaving tomorrow," no hesitation, no tremor. Silence cracked open like a fault line. My aunt's fork clinked against her plate, my cousin dropped her phone, and my mother's eyes widened just enough for me to know I had hit the place she spent years guarding. "Leaving where?" she whispered, as if distance was betrayal and not salvation. "Anywhere that isn't here," I replied. I didn't owe them a specific destination. Escape itself was direction. They rushed in, one by one, not with love but panic disguised as concern. My aunt insisted I wasn't thinking straight, offering to drive me to another appointment, as if therapy could undo history that spilled out in dates, smells, and midnight tremors. My mother leaned against the counter, arms crossed, voice honeyed with manipulation. "We just want you to get better," she murmured. Better. Their favorite word. Better meant obedient. Better meant quiet. Better meant erasing myself to make room for their comfort. But I knew now there was nothing wrong with me that leaving wouldn't fix. Trauma doesn't make you broken, staying where it happened does. I moved around the kitchen slowly, deliberately, pouring water, squeezing lemon, the sound of liquid hitting glass louder than any of their pleas. My father finally spoke, voice low, steady like he practiced sounding reasonable his whole life. "You're overreacting," he said. "Families go through things." My laugh slipped out again, quiet, almost gentle, but sharp enough to cut. "Families protect their children," I answered. What we had wasn't family, it was performance. His jaw tightened. He had no script for truth spoken calmly. They only knew how to fight tears or screams. Never still, unwavering clarity. That scared them more than anger ever could. I spent the rest of the day packing quietly, folding clothes with a precision that felt ritualistic, each shirt a memory, each pair of jeans a timeline. Each book a promise I made to the younger me who hid inside imagination, because real life was too sharp. I found my old bus pass from 2012, edges worn, photo faded, the face of a girl who still believed adults would save her if she screamed loud enough. I held it for a long time, thumb brushing the plastic, whispering, "I'm saving us now." The house felt smaller with every item I folded, like the walls were closing in not to trap me, but out of panic knowing I was slipping through their grip. Around sunset, the light hit my bedroom in that golden way that makes everything look softer, forgiving even, and for a second my heart ached not for them, but for the version of me who waited for them to become people they never had the capacity to be. That girl deserved tenderness, safety, truth. She deserved someone who believed her the first time she whispered it happened. And if no one ever gave her that, then I would. That was my duty now, representing the child they left alone in the attic of her own fear. Night came again, heavy, humid, cicadas buzzing outside like a pulse under the skin of the city, and I sat on my bed with my notebook open, writing everything I could remember, not to hold onto the pain, but to free it from the shadows. Trauma grows teeth in darkness, in light it becomes testimony. Pages filled with dates, voices, fragments, 2010, his footsteps at midnight. 2011, her whisper, don't start. 2013, lock clicking, pills offered, silence weaponized. I wasn't writing to convince anyone. I was writing to remember without shaking. Healing isn't forgetting. Healing is remembering without your body thinking you're still there. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps hover outside my door. Slow, hesitant, the way someone approaches a truth they can no longer outrun. My mother's voice came through soft, cracked, almost human. If you leave, people will talk, she whispered. I closed my eyes. There it was, not sorrow, not remorse, but fear of exposure, fear of whispers at church, fear of neighbors connecting dots she tried to scatter. Let them, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Truth has gravity even when whispered. She didn't answer. Footsteps retreated, and I imagined her gripping the banister the same way she gripped excuses white-knuckled and desperate. I lay down fully clothed, suitcase by the door, shoes beside the bed like a soldier ready to move before dawn. My heartbeat slowed, steady, sure, and for the first time in years, sleep came without choking. No attic. No footsteps. No locked room. Just breathing. Mind. Free. I dreamed of walking through a bus station at sunrise, backpack on my shoulders, air cool against my face, the city waking to possibility instead of dread. And in my dream, no one called me crazy. No one asked me to forget. No one asked me to fold myself into something easier to live with. I belonged to no one's narrative but my own. When I woke, still dark outside, I whispered to the quiet, to my younger self, to the house that thought it owned my voice, tomorrow I walk out that door. And you don't get to name me anymore. Because if you're still watching, it means something inside you resonates with this story. Don't scroll away. Pause, take a deep breath, and let yourself feel it. Comment below your thoughts or experiences, because your voice matters here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There's more truth coming, more stories that can change the way you see the world and yourself. Leaving isn't abandoning them, it's reclaiming myself. And survival isn't what happens in silence. Survival begins the moment you speak, and keep speaking, even when the walls tremble, even when they call you insane. I remember the exact night everything shifted, when the silence in the house became unbearable. Like it had mass, weight pressing down on my chest so hard I could barely breathe. It was September 14th, 2015, a Tuesday that began like any other, grey sky bleeding into the apartment in Sao Paulo where I had returned after dropping out of university, forced by my family's manipulation and their insistence that I rest because I was too sensitive, too emotional, too unstable to continue my life. The air was thick, humid from the lingering rain earlier in the afternoon, mixing with the faint smell of decaying flowers from the neighbor's balcony below. And I could hear the distant hum of traffic like a pulse I couldn't ignore. That night, I was sitting on my bed, knees tucked to my chest, fingernails digging into the worn mattress, the texture scratching into my palms. Listening to the whispers that carried from the living room voices my ears had memorized over. Years of fear, my mother's soft, rehearsed tone, my aunt's low murmurs of concern that never sounded real, and the way my father's silence loomed over everything like a spectre. I had learned early that silence could be weaponized. It could erase presence and enforce obedience. That evening, I had finally refused their attempts to gaslight me, for years. Every recollection I dared to speak, every fragment of memory I tried to share, had been met with calm dismissal. It didn't happen, they would say, you're imagining things. My memory was a crime scene they had cleaned meticulously, and my insistence that the past existed was treated as evidence of my own instability. But I had grown stronger. The notebook hidden under my bed contained dates, smells, fragments of voices, and small details no one else could remember: the creak of the attic door at 3:17 a.m., the exact stain on the wool blanket in winter 2009, the aftertaste of beer and cheap cologne that lingered in the hallways during the nights he entered my room. I held these details like a shield. That night, however, I felt the shield wobble. It wasn't fear of what they might do, but the terrifying recognition that they were aware I remembered, and I could see it in the way the words slipped from my mother's mouth when she thought I wasn't listening. "They can't keep pretending forever," I heard her whisper to my aunt, her voice so soft it might have been missed if I hadn't been trained for years to hear lies in every tone. My hands froze on the bedspread. My pulse kicked into overdrive. For a moment, I didn't breathe, because those words confirmed the truth I had long suspected. They knew that I wasn't delusional. They knew I remembered. And the fear in their whisper wasn't for me, it was for themselves, for the narrative they had spent years building to protect their reputations, their comfort, their carefully curated image of a family that appeared normal in front of the world. I could almost see them shrinking inside that living room, counting the years they had silenced me, realizing the control I still wielded simply by keeping my memory alive. I got up slowly, bare feet cold against the tile, and moved toward the living room, my heart hammering in a rhythm that made each step a declaration of rebellion. They looked up at me as I entered, startled, faces tense, and I finally spoke with a calmness I had cultivated through years of silent endurance. "I remember everything, just 4 words, simple, unadorned, but they hit the room with the force of an avalanche." My father's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the newspaper like it could protect him. My aunt froze mid-movement, holding a cup of coffee she had apparently been stirring for the past 10 minutes. My mother's carefully crafted mask of calm cracked, and in that moment, the fear that had lurked beneath her skin for years became visible. Their eyes darted between each other, calculating. Realizing they had underestimated me, they had always assumed compliance, they had assumed silence, they had assumed fear would always be stronger than memory. I continued, voice steady despite the quake in my stomach. "I remember the attic door creaking in 2009, the wool blanket, the smell of cologne mixed with beer, the nights I couldn't breathe. I remember the whispers downstairs, the way you told me it didn't happen, the nights locked in my room when you claimed I was imagining things. I remember February 11th, 2011. I remember every detail. My words were not a plea. They were a reckoning." Their faces paled, the composed masks they had worn for decades slipping like wet cloth. They tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand and continued, my voice gaining momentum. "I am not delusional. I am not confused. I am not broken. I am the only one here telling the truth, and I will not stop." The room was silent, suffocating, every heartbeat echoing in my ears like the toll of a bell. Their control, the careful construction of years of lies and denial, was crumbling before them, and for the first time, I felt a dangerous exhilaration. I realized the power I had carried inside me all those years had nothing to do with being loud. With anger, with confrontation, it was in remembering, in refusing to fold, in refusing to forget. And as I stood there, the first spark of real liberation igniting inside me, I reflected on the years of sacrifice they had demanded, my education interrupted, my freedom restricted, my voice silenced. I thought about the impossible requests, the constant reminders that I was too sensitive, too emotional, too broken to speak, and I understood that all along. The true impossibility was their expectation that I would obey, forget, and erase my own life for the sake of their comfort. That night, I returned to my room, notebook in hand, and began to write every memory, every date, every sensory fragment, every whispered lie they had tried to pass as truth. I wrote until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred, until the candle on my desk flickered and guttered, until the only sound in the apartment was my breathing and the scratching of my pen on paper. For the first time in years, I did not feel fear. I felt clarity. I felt ownership. I was no longer a child hiding in the shadows of their denial. I was a woman reclaiming the life and truth that had been denied to her for too long. And though the path ahead was uncertain, and though the family who had tried to erase me still existed in the same apartment, I knew one undeniable fact: memory was my rebellion. and I would carry it unflinchingly. I didn't sleep that night. My body was still, but my mind felt like a street in Sao Paulo at 3 in the morning, lights flickering, sirens distant, stray dogs barking at ghosts no one else could see. The city accepted chaos better than my house ever did. Every hour, the clock near the window clicked louder, like it was daring me to back down, like time itself wanted to see whether I would shatter or stand. But I didn't break. Not this time. I had spent 18 years being bent into silence, curled into obedience, shaped into someone small enough to fit inside their version of me. And now that I had stepped outside that version, there was no going back inside that cage. Not again. Not ever. By 6:14 a.m., the apartment was awake. I could hear the nervous footsteps, the half-whispered conversations, the low tone of panic disguised as concern. The same pattern I had seen my entire life, except this time I wasn't on the floor, trembling, begging them to explain why my memories felt real. This time I wasn't the one doubting myself. I walked to the kitchen, my feet cold on the old tiles, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally being awake in a life I had lived half asleep. My mother was standing by the stove making coffee like every other morning, except her eyes were red, swollen, and she pretended she hadn't been crying. My father sat at the table reading a newspaper he wasn't really reading. His right leg bounced under the table. He only did that when he was cornered. I knew his tells better than he ever realized. I poured a glass of water and felt their eyes on me, scanning every movement like I was a bomb they couldn't disarm. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee mixed with the metallic scent of nerves, sharp, acidic, heavy enough to taste. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was to calm, to measured, like she had practiced every word before I walked in. "We're worried about you." I almost laughed. The absurdity tasted bitter on my tongue. Worried about me. The girl they gaslight, isolated, medicated, silenced. They weren't worried, they were terrified. Terrified that memory had teeth and I had finally learned how to bite back. My father lowered the newspaper but didn't look at me. He was never the one to face confrontation directly. He preferred to sit in shadows, influence decisions, speak violence without raising his voice. Power in whispers, not fists. That morning, even his silence was shaking. Then came the sentence that wasn't new, but this time it landed differently. "You remember things wrong." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I didn't bend. "No," I replied, each word slow, precise, sharp enough to cut through the air like glass shards falling. "I remember what happened. You want it forgotten." That's not the same thing. My aunt, who had come early to help, sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching her phone like she had already looked up the number of a psychiatric clinic, the same one they threatened me with when I was 16, 19, and 22. I could almost hear her rehearsing the excuse. She's unstable. She needs treatment. The lie had always been ready, polished, elegant. But lies lose power when the truth refuses to bow. I sat at the table, my back straight, my voice steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't justifying my sanity. I wasn't begging them to hear me. I simply existed, and the truth existed with me. And that alone was enough to terrify them. "Do you know what it feels like?" I whispered, "to spend half your life believing your pain is a hallucination someone convinced you to have?" My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked down at her hands. "Do you know what it is to doubt your own body, your own mind, because the people who should protect you would rather protect their comfort, silence? The kind that isn't empty, the kind that screams." Then suddenly, like the world needed to puncture the tension, my phone vibrated. A message. Unknown number. Just 3 words, "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, pulse spiking, chest tightening. I knew who it was. Someone who had been there. Someone who shouldn't exist in this story anymore but did. My blood turned cold. My family noticed. They always noticed when I reacted without speaking. It scared them, because emotion without explanation was power they couldn't decode or manipulate. My mother swallowed hard. "Who is it?" "No one," I lied, placing the phone screen down. Inside me, something old and sacred shifted, the part of me that had been buried under years of denial suddenly standing taller. For the first time, I saw a sliver of their future, sitting in that same apartment, pretending nothing happened, while my truth escaped, piece by piece, story by story, into the world beyond those walls. And fear flickered in their eyes again. Real fear. Not anger. Not control. Fear of consequences. Fear of exposure. Fear of me, the version of me who remembered everything. And in that moment, I felt a calm wash over me, almost like forgiveness, but sharper. I realized that I didn't need them to acknowledge anything. Their recognition wasn't the gate to my freedom. My voice was. My memory was. My refusal to shrink ever again was. They didn't own the narrative anymore. They didn't own me. Not now. Not ever again. And as I stood and left the table, I whispered not to them, but to myself, a vow spoken into the morning air like a prophecy. I will not be erased. I thought that morning would end with silence. Like so many others did in that house, silence that crawled into the corners, thick as smoke, heavy as guilt. But the truth has a way of changing the air around you, even when you try to breathe quietly. And as I walked back to my room, I could feel the weight of every year pressing behind me, like footsteps I had tried to outrun finally catching up. I closed the door. It wasn't loud, but it echoed. My room felt smaller than ever, walls pale, paint chipped. The smell of old paper and lavender detergent lingering from when I washed my sheets by hand during those years they said I was too emotional to do anything else. There were nights I sat on that floor, tracing cracks in the tile and whispering to myself so I wouldn't forget who I was, who I used to be, who they were trying to erase. I sat at my desk and picked up the notebook, the one with the frayed corners and the ink smudges from when my hands shook writing inside it. I ran my fingers over the pages, feeling every indentation. Memory isn't just something we store in our minds. It lives in our skin, our bones, our breath. I wrote because writing meant proof. Proof I existed. Proof the moments I lived weren't illusions. Proof I was not the story they invented about me. At 9:42 a.m., someone knocked softly. Not a real knock, the testing kind, the kind used by people who want entry but don't know if they still have the right. My mother's voice seeped through the wood, fragile, careful, as if her tongue was made of glass. Podemos conversa, I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I didn't have words, but because for once, I wanted her to sit in the uncertainty, the same uncertainty I drowned in for years when I asked, did it really happen? Am I losing my mind? Why won't you look at me when I talk about it? Seconds stretched, a minute. Another. I heard her sigh, that long, exhausted sigh I used to interpret as love, as pain, as proof she cared. Now I heard it for what it was, fear, frustration that control was slipping through her fingers. The handle turned, but the lock held. I had started locking the door again 2 weeks earlier, after years of being told I didn't need privacy in a house where my thoughts were already treated like open walls. She didn't speak again. She just waited. And there was a moment, a brief, sharp one, where I almost opened it. Old instincts pulling at me, the reflex to soothe, to explain, to shrink for their comfort. But survival had rewired me, and I stayed silent. After minutes that felt like hours, she walked away. I heard hushed voices again. My aunt. My father's heavier steps pacing. I imagined them piecing plans, hunting for strategies the way hunters sharpen knives before a chase. Maybe they wanted to convince me, I imagined again. Maybe they wanted me quiet. Maybe they wanted to send me away for rest, like before, when I spent 43 days in a private clinic in 2018. A clinic that cost 12 reals. 800 and came with white walls, locked windows, forced pills, and a doctor who looked at me like trauma was a hobby and pain a performance. I came back hollow and obedient for a while. But memory has a pulse, and mine refused to die. At 11:03, my phone buzzed again. Same number. I need to see you. There are things you don't know. My chest tightened. A different kind of fear now. Outside fear, not just inside these walls. Someone who remembered. Someone who lived a piece of it too. Someone who had disappeared when everything fell apart, leaving me to be the unstable one. I typed back slowly, fingers trembling like the first time I held a truth too big for my hands. What things? A pause, then not by message. They can twist messages. Face to face. My stomach dropped. Not because I didn't believe them, but because I did. And truth spoken out loud is heavier than truth whispered in a notebook. I slid down onto the floor, back against the bed frame, hugging my knees. The tile was cold, grounding. Outside, a motorcycle roared past on Avenida Paulista. Life kept moving, indifferent to the avalanche inside me. I closed my eyes and felt time stretch thin, like a thread about to snap. I could hear the clock ticking from the hallway, each second a reminder that every memory I carried had consequences, not just for me, but for everyone who spent decades wrapping lies like gift paper around something rotten. And there, in that quiet, something inside me broke, but not in the old way. Not the collapsing, suffocating break. This was different. This was widening. A crack that let air in, light in, possibility in. I realized that truth wasn't just a wound, it was a door. And I had stepped through it, even if every part of me shook. I whispered to myself, barely audible, but enough to feel real. I survived their story. Now I get to tell mine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of remembering. I was scared of forgetting who I had finally become. I didn't realize how long I had been sitting there until the light shifted, that pale late morning sun sneaking through the blinds, cutting my room into stripes of dust and memory. My notebook remained open on the desk, a witness to my insomnia and stubbornness. My heart had calmed, but that calm wasn't peace. It was the stillness before the ground opens. The kind that makes you feel like the air is waiting for something to happen, something irreversible. At 12:27 p.m., the doorbell rang. 3 short chimes. Not random. Not a delivery. Not a neighbor. It was the kind of ring that carried intention, certainty, a pulse of someone who knew exactly where they were and why. My stomach tightened. I didn't move at first. I listened. Footsteps. A murmur from my aunt. My father clearing his throat, that nervous, deep sound he made only when his control faltered. A chair scraped. My mother whispered something urgent and sharp, too low to catch. Silence. Then footsteps again, toward my room. My heart started pounding the way it did years ago when I used to hide under the table during fights, when every footstep meant danger or blame. I stood before I could stop myself, palms damp, knees trembling. I was not the child in that memory, but trauma doesn't check your age before it grabs you. A knock. Softy, careful. Someone's here to see Voka, my mother said, voice tight, fragile in that way only guilt can make it. I didn't answer. If I opened my mouth too soon, I'd give them the reaction they wanted, confusion, hesitation, doubt. But I wasn't doubting anymore. Doubt had kept me prisoner. Now, the only thing I feared was returning to silence. Another knock, then a voice, familiar, rough around the edges, like too many years carrying truth without release. Sue you, my breath froze in my lungs. I hadn't heard that voice in almost 8 years. 8 years. 8 years since the night I was told I imagined everything and they disappeared, suddenly shipped to another city, as if distance could wash someone clean. 8 years since I sat on the edge of my bed at 16, staring at my hands and wondering if reality was dissolving or if I was. 8 years since the house smelled like panic and bleach, and every relative spoke in codes and ellipses, never words. And now the past stood 3 steps away, separated from me by one thin door and everything they tried to bury. I opened it slowly. They looked older, leaner. Eyes tired in a way that only comes from running, from truth, from ghosts, from yourself. Their hair was shorter, clothes simple, hands trembling just enough to betray the weight they carried. When our eyes met, a jolt ran through me, part recognition, part pain, part that strange relief you feel when you realize a nightmare wasn't just a dream, someone else lived it too. You remember, they whispered, almost like it hurt to say. I never forgot, their lips trembled, and I saw guilt, raw, human guilt, not performance, not manipulation. The kind that gnaws and corrodes and steals sleep, the kind my family never showed. Behind them, my mother hovered, pale, jaw hard, fingers digging into her own wrists the way she used to when she lied. My father stayed in the living room, pretending to read, but his eyes were glass. My aunt clutched her rosary. Funny how religion is always loudest in the houses where truth is most buried. I stepped into the hallway, shutting the bedroom door behind me. My family flinched like even the sound of wood closing was a threat. "What do you want?" my mother asked, but her voice cracked on the last word. She already knew. She feared it. They didn't look at her. They looked at me. Only at me. To tell the truth, 3 words soft, but they detonated across the walls like explosives. My mother's face drained of color. My father muttered something too quiet to understand. My aunt made the sign of the cross like truth was blasphemy. I swallowed, throat dry as chalk. Why now a pause, a breath, eyes shining, not with weakness, but with the exhaustion of someone who carried silence too long. Because I can't watch you carry it alone anymore, my knees almost buckled. Years of holding myself upright, shoulders tense from the invisible weight, and suddenly someone stood beside me, not on the other side. Not denying, not erasing. Someone who had been part of the storm, and now came not to defend themselves, not to justify, but to confirm, to witness, to make me real. A memory flashed, us younger, years before the night everything ended. Sitting in the backyard, eating pão com manteiga at 4 p.m., sunlight hitting the old brick wall, laughter that didn't feel haunted yet. I remembered thinking back then that family meant protection, love, safety. But safety is fragile when built on silence. My mother's voice cut the moment like a knife. Voca não vai destruir nossa família como essas histórias. I turned to her, calm, steady, anchored in something unshakable now. You destroyed it when you called the truth a story. She flinched, the smallest movement, but I saw it. They all saw it. My father's leg bounced violently under the table. My aunt clutched her rosary like it was a life jacket. And the person beside me, the one who left, who vanished into distance and denial, took one step closer, as if to say, "Not this time, not again." I exhaled slowly. For the first time, the fear didn't drown me. It sharpened me. Strength isn't loud. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to collapse. "I'm not afraid of remembering anymore," I said softly. "But you should be. No screaming, no chaos. Just truth, simple, steady, unnegotiable." That was the moment I understood something terrifying and beautiful. The truth doesn't make the past smaller. It makes me bigger than it. And they saw it in my eyes. The girl who once shook in shadows had become someone who could burn a room simply by standing in the doorway. The silence after that wasn't oppressive like before. It was surrender, not mine, theirs. I remember the morning light spilling into my apartment in a way that felt almost sacred, soft gold stretching across the cracked tiles. A light that didn't just touch the floor, but seemed to press gently against my chest, reminding me that I was still here, still breathing, still alive. The apartment smelled of coffee and old books, the remnants of nights I spent writing in my notebook, writing to survive, writing to prove I existed beyond their lies. Outside, Sao Paulo moved on without notice. Buses rumbled down Avenida Paulista, motorbikes zipped past, construction drills pierced the air, and yet, for the first time in years, the city's chaos didn't mirror the storm in me. I felt calm, heavy, but grounded in a truth I had fought for my entire life. I sat at the edge of my bed, bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor, notebook open on my lap, pen in hand, and stared at the words I had written over the past weeks. Each page was a battlefield, dates, names, smells, sounds, fragments of voices, moments I was told didn't exist. February 11th, 2011. The smell of the hallway carpet after they poured bleach to erase what they didn't want remembered. June 23rd, 2014. The scratch of the attic door under my father's hand, the taste of pills he tried to force down my throat. Each fragment a scar, each memory a proof of survival. I traced the lines with my thumb and realized something terrifying and beautiful. The past didn't have power over me anymore. I had power over it. I had reclaimed it. I remembered the first time I tried to speak the truth and no one believed me. I was 16, sitting on the floor of the living room, knees tucked to my chest, whispering the words I had learned to hold like a secret shield. It happened. My mother smiled at me, not with warmth, but with a practiced calm that shattered inside me every time she uttered it. My father didn't look up from the newspaper. My aunt shook her head. And I had believed, back then, that my voice was too fragile to matter, that maybe I was imagining it all, that maybe I was broken. Years of therapy, of silence, of forced obedience, had convinced me that my memories were a problem, that my voice was a danger, and that my existence needed editing to make them comfortable. But now I realized that the problem had never been me. The problem was their lies, their manipulations, the way they built a house of illusions and expected me to live in it quietly, erasing myself in the process. And I had survived. I had survived without their validation, without their apology, without a single adult acknowledging what happened. I had survived alone, carrying every detail, every sound, every scent, every shadow that haunted the corridors of my youth. And surviving wasn't enough anymore. I needed to live, really live, to step out of the shadows and into the light that had always been there, waiting for the person I was becoming. I stood and moved to the window. The city stretched below me, endless, noisy, indifferent, yet welcoming in a way my childhood home never was. I pressed my hands against the glass, feeling the vibrations of traffic, the hum of life, the pulse of a world that didn't know my story and yet would one day have to reckon with it. I whispered to myself, barely audible, but enough for the walls to hear, I am not broken. I am not invisible. I am not theirs to silence. And in that whisper, I felt the weight I had carried for decades begin to lift. Not all at once, but enough to breathe without fear. Enough to move without apology. Enough to finally see myself. I thought about the moments when I wanted to disappear. The nights in the attic, the basement, the rooms where I was told I was too much, too sensitive, too unstable, too loud for their fragile reality. I remembered the impossible requests, be quiet, don't tell anyone, forget it ever happened, and I realized that obeying them would have meant erasing myself entirely. I thought about the pain, the manipulation, the false narratives that had been etched into every corner of my mind, and I understood that my survival wasn't just escaping them physically. It was reclaiming the narrative of my life. It was taking back every memory, every feeling, every sensation that was mine and refusing to let them own it any longer. I sat back down, opening my notebook once more, and wrote, I am free. I will not disappear. I will not silence myself. The pen felt heavier than ever before, not because of weight, but because of meaning. Every stroke, every word, every line was a boundary, a monument, a claim. I existed. I remembered. I mattered. And for the first time, I understood that freedom isn't given. It isn't earned by obeying or waiting. It is seized. It is carried forward in every choice, every step, every word spoken aloud. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows shifted on the walls. And I realized that my journey was not about revenge or proving anything to anyone who had tried to erase me. It was about life, reclaiming it, claiming it fully, loudly, unapologetically. I was the witness to my own survival. And survival alone was not enough. I needed to live. To feel. To speak. To exist without fear. I looked into the mirror finally, the reflection of a woman who had been a child too long, and smiled softly. Not a smile for anyone else, but for myself. The girl who had been told she was crazy, who had been forced into silence, who had been manipulated, gaslight, and ignored, she was here, whole, scarred, and fiercely alive. And in that moment, I whispered one last time, to the room, to the past, to the city, I survived. I remembered. And now I live, and with that the silence that had defined decades of my life finally ended. I was no longer defined by their lies, no longer diminished by their denial, no longer trapped by the shadows of the past. I was free, and this time freedom had a face. Mine. Now that you've heard my story, I want you to ask yourself, what truth are you holding inside? Don't hide it. Don't ignore it. Share it in the comments, like this video if it moved you, and subscribe to join a community that refuses to stay silent, because remembering, speaking, and surviving, that's how we reclaim our lives, and together we rise.